We pushed upriver in the late rains of 1892, bound for the trading posts beneath Stanley Falls, crates of beads and cloth lashed to the deck. What began as a routine cargo run turned into one of those nights I could not have explained then. Whispers on the riverbank of a thing the men called the river beast, and a chill that settled over our instruments. I commanded a small commercial party that summer. 2 clerks, Harris and Lowe, a helmsman named Mbala, 20 rivermen whose faces the rain had carved into the same somber expression, and several porters following in the shallows. Our vessel was a flat-bottomed steam launch of modest build, its boiler stoked with riverwood and its hull painted to weather the brown swell. 2 narrow pirogues trailed at anchor lines, ready to carry goods and men to the shallows where the launch could not pass. We carried kerosene lamps in iron boxes, a brass sextant and a pocket chronometer for dead reckoning when the sky permitted a sun or star to be taken, trade goods, ivory ledgers, bolts of cotton cloth, strings of Venetian beads, and salted provisions meant to keep the posts below Stanley Falls supplied through the coming rains. The late rains had swelled the Lualaba beyond its usual banks. Trees that in dry seasons stood on firm ground now leaned with their roots in the current. The air was dense with damp, and the smell of wet bark, a fine, persistent rain smeared the world into a wash of brown and green. Our men moved on the deck with practiced caution, their bare feet sure among coils and crates. Harris kept the manifests in a leather folio beneath his arm. Lowe tended the lamps, trimming wicks with the steady hand of a man who had seen too many wet nights. Mbala steered by eye and the low thrum of the engine, calling the depth and the hazards in a voice as soft as the rain. Navigation upriver was a matter of patience and small instruments. When the sky opened, we set the sextant and took a sun sight. When it did not, we ran by dead reckoning, measuring our progress in strokes and time, noting the bend of the river against the charts made of hurried ink back at the station. The chronometer was wound each morning and set against Harris. Watch its brass case caught the light like a small, obstinate sun. Yet there was a peculiar tendency to error that evening. Numbers that would not agree, bearings that required 2 reckonings before we would accept them. The compass, a small one in a gimbal on the quarter, trembled as though undecided. Mbala frowned and tapped the varnished rim. At dusk, we made our halt beneath a high bank of tangled vines. The launch's steam shuddered down to a low, patient hiss as the men gathered the lamps. The kerosene smelled of paraffin and smoke. The wick flame threw small, steady ovals on crates of ivory ledgers stacked like pale bones. We lashed a spare pirogue and sent 2 men ashore to find a place to beach. Their boots sank in the mud. They returned with a strange look in their eyes and a thinness to their voices. "It moves by the roots," one of them said, spitting a line of tobacco into the water. "Old men at the last post. They said it comes with the new floods. They call it the river beast." Names had weight on the river, and my men, who had seen crocodiles and the occasional errant hippopotamus, did not exchange the sort of jokes sailors make to fill the world with noise. Instead, they checked lamps and tightened straps and stood in a spread that divided the deck from the bank. I made the rounds of our small instruments, noting the fog on the sextant's horizon glass, though the air was not yet cold, and the slight retardation in the chronometer's hands that scarce amounted to more than a few seconds yet, troubled me more than the rain. Harris, ever practical, blamed damp. Lo refused to sleep until the lamps were trimmed and the iron boxes latched. Night drew its curtains sooner than usual, as though the rain hastened the dark. On the bank, when the lamps were set to burn and the men had their rolls of salted meat, a whisper ran along the murk like a small animal. The word river beast carried without any human shape to it. Mbala listened with his jaw set and did not deny it. The river closed in around us. The launch creaked in its slack mooring. Beyond the small ring of lamplight, the trees seemed to lean closer, and once, from the brush, there came a sound like a great foot sliding across wet moss, indistinct, and vanished before any man could say whether it had been a branch or a breathing. We made our plans for the morning, to move at first light, to keep to the main channel, to deliver our goods beneath the falls, and be back before the rains made the portage treacherous. Yet, as I wrote in my small, sodden journal that night, the instruments themselves had given me a reason to be wary. They are the companions of every man who would cross unknown water when they falter. A different vigilance must rise. I put the chronometer on the table beside my lamp, wound it once more, and listened to the rain as if the river itself might answer. The men slept in shifts, but none of us truly closed our eyes. Dawn would tell whether the river beast had been a shadow and a story, or whether some other thing lay waiting in the rise of the waters. Our trading mission began with a ledger and a chest of calico, brass wire, glass beads, tobacco, and a small chronometer set to Greenwich. In the wet season of 1892, we floated a shallow-hulled launch into a narrow channel of the Congo, the rainforest closing in with a dank mist that smelled of rotten palm and iron. Kerosene lamps along the quarterdeck drew clouds of mosquitoes each evening. The men swatted, cursed, and the current ran sluggish after the rains, carrying leaves and pale husks of fruit past our bows. On the banks, the village houses crouched beneath buttressed trees. At first, the people came, silent and wary. They stepped back when we offered mirrors and beads. They refused to trade fish and pointed at the water. An elder, bent with years and scarred with ceremonial cuts, took my hand and spoke in low tones by the lantern's smear. He named no spirit I knew through our interpreter. He said that the beast had been taking nets and upsetting canoes for weeks. He turned his face to the channel, and our men could not meet his eyes. We examined the evidence. Fishermen's nets on the bank bore great rents, as though torn by enormous teeth. A dugout canoe lay half submerged, its aft timbers splintered, the bow still tethered to a pole. Each morning we sounded the water with a lead and line, took bearings with the compass, noted depth with the sextant, and set observations in the log. The barometer fell and rose with the storms. My assistants, Jules and Kimbundu, tightened hemp lines and inspected the anchor their hands were raw from hauling. At dusk, one afternoon, we trailed a small skiff behind the launch, 2 to row and 2 to watch. Rain had left a sheen on the channel, and an oil slick of insects began to hiss and strike in the lamplight. We lowered a lamp into the skiff, letting it swing from a hook to throw a small circle of gold upon the water. For an hour the river lay like warmed glass. Then there came a sound, low and close, a dull thudding like a distant great heart. Jules murmured, the oars slackened. Something moved below, not a ripple, but a mass shifting the current, pushing sediment in a slow pulse. The lamplight caught wet skin, a lobe, the suggestion of a ridge along its flank. It was darker than water, and it smelled of mud and iron, the same bitter tang we had known since the banks. For a moment, I thought it a submerged log until the mass rose, not high, but enough to break the oily surface and set the skiff quivering on a new wake. We saw then a head, broad, low, and without the pointed snout of any crocodile I had known. It bore a heavy brow and eyes that reflected like coal. Around the head lay a fringe of whisker-like filaments, long and blunt, moving with the eddies. The skin was thick and pebbled, pocked with pale scars. Jules hissed and dropped the lamp. The glass cracked, sending a star of light into the wet. The beast answered with a hollow bellow that set the ribs of the skiff trembling. The men scrambled. Kimbundu seized a paddle and flung it. The wooden blade struck with a dull, wet sound. The beast recoiled, and the skiff pitched. We could not get the launch between it and the bank in time. I fired my service revolver into the air, not to wound, but to make noise. The report seemed to shrug along the trees and do little. The beast moved away with a force that dragged a wide wake down the channel, and it pulled at the tether of the half-sunk canoe we had passed. By the time we reached the spot, we found scuff marks on the muddy bank and the torn end of a net snagged upon a root. At dawn, we found a pirogue beached and splintered, paddles sheared clean, and hemp rope frayed as though by enormous teeth our barometer had spiked in the night, and the chronometer lost a half hour of time. Near the bank, the reed mats were trampled in an arc too broad for a crocodile, and the men pointed to long, parallel gouges in the mud, marks that suggested great weight and an odd dragging motion. The light was grey and thin, a river mist that sat in the hollows of the palms and dulled the gilt of our instruments. I remember the taste of iron in my mouth and the slight tremor of cold in my fingers as I set down the chronometer and brought the sextant from its case to test the horizon. I could not reconcile the instrument's loss of time with any ordinary miscalculation. We had checked the chronometer the evening before. By the hands of the mate and my own, there had been no neglect. The half hour had vanished as though devoured by the night. We went ashore in a small party, 3 of my best paddlers and my mate, with a Martini Henry slung at his shoulder and a Webley revolver at his hip. Our boots sank in ooze, scented of decaying plant and fish, the reeds whispered with insects, and the low cry of some river bird. The men worked with the sobriety of those who have seen rivers change their face. They moved quietly, feeling across the bank with hands that were used to ropes and oars, not to handling anything so large. They did not speak of monsters. Instead, they measured and compared, a tradesman's instinct applied to the unnatural. The sheared paddles lay like matchwood beneath a jut of palm root. The pirogue itself had been shoved inboard and left on its gunwale as if the water had decided, and then by an afterthought been drawn off again. Where the hemp rope had been fastened, the fibres were rent and chewed in a way I had seen only in carriage wheels after a storm, not by beasts. I sent one of the men to fetch the barometer. It hung like a small bell beneath the thwart and showed the same inexplicable spike. He returned with mud on his ankles and the look of a man who had not slept. The headman crossed himself and spat into the river, then stooped to examine a cluster of hoof-shaped depressions. He said nothing of names, but made the tiny, universal sounds men make when their private dread is spoken aloud, an intake of breath, a whisper to say we were not alone. The gouges in the mud were the strangest thing. They ran for some 20 paces, 2 parallel lines the width of a small cart, and between them The mud was scored as if by a cable dragged from beneath. Our boots had sounded doubly hollow as we stepped over them. They revealed a creature not only of great mass, but of unnatural movement, alternately dragging and levering itself as it advanced. I set a pole across the furrow and measured its breadth nearly 3 feet from each gouge to the pole. The men argued softly whether this could be the work of the great cat of neighboring forests or of a hippopotamus gone from its usual places. Yet both suggestions faltered when I demonstrated the arc the reeds had been forced into. The shape of a hulking limb, or perhaps the sweep of a tail. We searched the pirogue for signs of struggle, broken trade goods, a scrap of cloth, but found only a smear of something that shone like oil under the sun. It resisted the light-fingered examination of our traders and left a bitter tang on the tongue when a man, heedless, licked his thumb. Whatever had taken to the bank had not taken men, for we found no footprints to match our own. Only those parallel gouges and the reeds pressed down as if by a weight the men could not imagine lifting. My mate tightened his jaw and checked the cartridges in his belt. The click of brass was a small, precise noise against a landscape of vague enormities. We followed the trail along the margin, keeping the river between us and the thick jungle. The gouges led to a bend where the water ran thin and lighter in color, as if some great thing had disturbed the silt beneath. There the men halted. From the river came a sound that was not wholly animal nor wholly wind, a wet, resonant sigh that set the reeds to trembling. It was the kind of sound one feels in the bones rather than hears with the ear, the sort that makes hands go cold, and a man ask, in a voice that would not be his, whether to stay or to run. We made no decision then. We lashed the pirogue's broken remnants to the stern of ours, and with measured hands we re-embarked, leaving a few of the men to keep watch on the slim bank. My mate set the course upriver. The compass needle trembled as if uncertain itself. As we shoved from shore, the headman looked back once, and his face, normally imperturbable, had the expression of a man given to accepting loss. Behind us, the reeds whispered, and the river sighed again. We pushed on under the pall of morning, every stroke slow, the memory of those parallel gouges, and the frayed hemp like an unseen thing riding our bows, and the notion that the river had, in the night, grown a new secret that would not be satisfied with our curiosity. That night, with only kerosene lanterns and a service revolver between us and the dark, the river broke as if some vast animal had pushed to the surface. A wet, undulating mass rose alongside the launch, slick with algae and bearing ridged plates that struck the hull with a sound like falling timber. The lanterns, guttered with the spraymen who had been spoken to moments before, fell to a silence that tasted of metal and oil. One of the pirogues, its bows scarcely resting on the current, was thrown aside as if a great hand had heaved it. A man tumbled into the water and disappeared beneath the black. For an instant, I saw only foam and the dim wheel of the moon on the river. We fired. We had a few weapons fit for such an hour, my service revolver and 2 rifles belonging to my stewards. And the shot rang out more from habit than hope. The volleys cracked into the dark lead-struck water and wood. The creature answered with a long, guttural noise that set our teeth on edge, and then withdrew as suddenly as it had come, leaving a line of disturbed water and the flapping remnant of a canoe where the pirogue had been. We thrust lanterns toward the place where the man had gone, the light trembling over weed-choked eddies, and called his name until our throats were raw. There was no body. We hauled the pirogue alongside and found its bow split, planks crushed inward, and the paint gone in wide strips. A handful of goods, tins of preserved meat, a case of bar iron, had been lost to the river. The men moved with a practiced economy, born of many hard days. Tar boiled over the old iron stove, a spare plank was planed down, and nailed, the bilge pump was worked without pause. Though the launch took more water than I had thought possible for a vessel of her size. The man who had been thrown in, Macaulay, did not reappear. His seat lay empty. His cap floated away like a dead thing. I set the chronometer and took our bearing by the stars, as if that would answer what the river had dealt us. We rigged lines between the launch and the remaining pirogues, and lashed the broken canoe with tarred rope. The men spoke in low tones. No outcry, only the sober commands of men bent on keeping a fragile thing afloat. One of the stewards chewed his tobacco until the leaf was a black stain between his teeth. Between our lanterns, the ridged plates on the hull gleamed for a moment as the beast turned away. They were like the back of some great armored serpent, not scales, but broad overlapping ridges, each the breadth of a man's palm. That the attack was physical, I could not deny. The evidence was the rent in the planking, the loss of stores, and the absence of Macaulay. That it was anything like a species known to natural history, I could not claim with certainty. Local men muttered of river spirits and ancestors. Our pilot, a man who had guided canoes for 20 years, spat into the river and said he had never seen such a thing in his life. The logs we kept afterward were fuller with measures and repairs than with conjecture. We recorded the hour, 1140 p.m., the latitude by our chronometer, and the fact that we had expended 6 rounds of rifles and 3 of the revolver into the water. We did not tarry. At dawn, the launch moved slowly downstream to a sandbar where we made what temporary repairs we could. Spare planks trued and clenched, seams caulked with oakum and pitch. We buried nothing. Where Macaulay had been was only a smear of disturbed water and the memory of his shout. I signed the duty book with a hand that would not still. The stewards refused to travel at night. Thereafter, the log bears entries of midday moves and long daylight hours spent with wary eyes fixed upon the dark mirror of the river. In the weeks that followed, our company men told the tale in trading houses and on wharves, in a tone that mixed skepticism with the sober addition of measures. More lanterns, doubled watches, a change of route where reed-choked channels gave way to open water. I sent a formal report to my employers, measured and plain, and an informal one to a naturalist acquaintance whose letters from London spoke often of unknown species. He replied with questions and with a politely folded doubt. Locals offered older stories, tales of a thing that comes when the moon is thin, of long backs rising through the weeds. They were not the kind of evidence science requires, yet their likeness to what we had seen kept the matter from being dismissed wholly. We departed the stretch of river where the plates had struck our hull that same week. Our pace quickened, and our lanterns banked against the dark. I could not say whether the thing that had risen beside us was monster or an old and secret species of some shy creature of the deep. Only that the river keeps its counsel, and that men who trade upon it must now keep their eyes open when night falls. The lessons settled into our journals and the memory of the men who were with me. the sound of ridged plates on wood, like timber tumbling into the dark, and that guttural cry whose echo remains with me in the quiet hours, a question that the river has not yet answered. We limped back to the nearest trading post beneath a low, bruised sky, our hull hairline split aft of the sternpost, the smell of oil and wet wood thick about the decks. It was July of 1892. The air held that damp, metallic heat of the Congo in the dry season's end. 2 of my hands were bandaged, their shirts stuck to their backs with river silt and blood. The pirogue that had borne our smaller stores was gone. Only a length of frayed rope and a smear of bark splinters marked the place where she had been taken from us. I set the pen to the ship's log and, with the measured formality taught me by years of navigation and trade, entered the incident as an unknown aquatic animal. There was no ready word for what had rent our gear and driven the men half mad with fright. We had navigated with charts scratched in pencil, a compass whose card had fogged, and a lead line grooved by repeated sounding. Our chronometer had kept its hour, but the rest of my instruments betrayed the night, the sextant tossing uselessly beneath the awning when the river rose. I noted temperatures, the heavy breath of rain on tarpaulins, the inability of the hull to answer the press of water as it had always done. Those are the small, verifiable things I trusted when larger certainties failed. At the trading post, the master, a man who had known the river 10 years longer than I, read my log with a face like wet rope. He ordered the men to pitch a temporary patch with canvas and pine, to caulk the seams with pitch heated in a pot over an open flame. They set up lamps and took to watch in pairs, muttering prayers in the vernacular and in English, fingers worrying rosaries and the better supplied beads of the village. No man there scoffed openly. The map on his wall, inked with routes and barter points, was marked thereafter with a bold cross where we had met the hazard. For months they altered their routes, sending caravans and launches across a wider bend, avoiding the stretch where our pirogue disappeared. I questioned the 2 wounded at the pirogue's bedside under the eaves, their voices thin and quick like frightened birds. One spoke of a swell that rose without wind, a wall of water that smelled of rot and fresh vegetation both. The other said he had seen a head above the water, too large for any crocodile he had known, and a skin that shone like oil. Neither could agree on scale. Memory narrowed oddly under the pressure of fright, but both agreed on the sound, a low, resonant bellow, like a bell struck beneath the river. I recorded their statements as precisely as I might a cargo manifest. Names, wounds, the times of their utterances. I noted also that the men of the village, women who mended nets, elders who sat beneath banana leaves, spoke with a steadier cadence. They told of a river beast, a creature that rose with the river, that had been known in tales when the river first took men and left only a hat upon the bank. We repaired as best we could. Timber and pitch mended the cracknails driven home, made the hull serviceable. We bound the sleeping men in canvas slings and wrapped their wounds with oil and bandage. We set out again with a lighter cargo and a heavier caution. No night travel past the marked bend, sentinels at bow and stern with rifles and lanterns, the flares of kerosene kept dry. Each crossing thereafter was done with wet palms and slow hands, an examination of planks, a test of bilge, a counting of men. The river beast remained in the villagers' stories and in my own journal. They swore by charms, I swore by ink. Where superstition met method, I found no reconciliation. I left the post with more questions than answers. a patched keel, and two men whose eyes darted at every swell. The master's map still bore that cross. My logbook contained the cold entry of an unknown aquatic animal and the testimony of hands that had felt its wake. The river kept its secrets, and in crossing it thereafter, the memory of the river rising has haunted every subsequent crossing.